Now here in another Dart deep dive, I want to explore another key value that we have in Dart and therefore also in Flutter, and a relatively new concept that was added to Dart and Flutter. And that would be the value null or the value type null and a concept called null safety. Now let's understand what a null value is. It's a special kind of built-in value, and it can be very useful if you, for example, want to reset a value. Let's say you have a variable username, and that initially has a value of max. Now you get that from some user input anywhere in your app, and at some point in your app, you want to clear this, you want to reset it. Now what you could then do in such a case is you could set it back to an empty string. Another value you could use to express your intention that you don't want to have a value right now though would be the special null value. Now if you use null here, I'm getting an error because I got null safety turned on here in Dartpad. And in Flutter apps you also might have this turned on. Now I'll come back to null safety in a second. For the moment, we can turn it off here in Dartpad by clicking on this toggle at the bottom. Now I'm assigning this special null value to username. And with that, I'm saying, hey, username at this point here shouldn't have a value anymore because I don't need this name anymore because it was entered in a form which now was reset, something like that. We'll see use cases where we might want to store a null value throughout the discourse. And therefore null is a special kind of value. It simply expresses that we don't want to have a value at a certain point. We could assign it here to reset some value. Alternatively, if I comment this out, we could also have a scenario where we don't have a value initially, where initially username doesn't contain a value, and therefore initially this actually is null, and then only at a certain point we assign a value to it. This would be the other way around. Now it's initially an empty value, but at some point we assign a value. By the way, this approach is also allowed if you enable null safety. But again, I'll come back to that in a second. Let's turn it off for now. So null is a value that you could have initially if you haven't assigned a value yet, or which you assign explicitly at some point to reset or clear a variable or property you might be working with. Now this null value can especially be useful if you have Boolean comparisons, if you have a if check for example, and you only want to proceed if username does have a value. You could, for example, check if username is not equal to null and only continue if it's not null. That is some code which you could write, and then you would only proceed if you have a value, and if on the other hand you deliberately set it to null, you would avoid executing such code. Again, I'm aware that this is pure theory here, but we'll see use cases like this and we'll see the null value throughout this course. But with that, let's dive into another key topic, the topic of null safety. The idea behind null safety is a relatively new one in Dart and therefore also in Flutter, and in the end it's all about avoiding bugs that you might have in your application, so errors that you might have in your application, because you might be trying to work with a value in some place of your code where it might be null. If you use if checks like this, where you explicitly check if something is null or not, you can avoid such errors, because then you always know that inside of this if check, username won't be null, because you're checking for it here. But you also might have other scenarios where you don't have such a if check, and where instead you continue working with a certain value, and you as a developer might know that at the point you're using it, it shouldn't be null, but maybe you have some scenario in your code where it could be null, and then your application could crash at runtime. And the idea behind null safety simply is that Dart runs extra checks on your code behind the scenes to catch such scenarios. And let me show you a little bit of a more concrete example here. up to this point in the course, we worked on outputting questions and answers for these questions. And if you did set up your project with these starting files I provided to you, that should work for you just fine. It's especially important that in your pubspec.yaml file, you have your environment set to SDK greater 2.11.0. If you have a different setting here, for example, greater than 2.12.0, if I change my setting to that, then you would actually be getting errors in the code we wrote thus far. You would be getting an error in answer.dart if you're using function here instead of void callback, but that's not related to this null thing here. That's only Flutter complaining that there is a more specific description of the kind of function that we expect for a select handler available, that we want a function that doesn't return a value, a so-called void callback. But you would also have an error in main Dart where we actually get the complaint that the argument of type object ? Can't be assigned to the parameter type string. And that's null safety in action here. Null safety in Flutter projects is enabled by setting this environment in the pubspec.yaml file to a value greater or equal to 2.12. And that's why I set it to 2.11, because this disables null safety, and that's not a problem here because the code I show you will work. It doesn't crash. It will work just fine. But with enabled null safety, Dart runs some extra checks, which in this case complain about a problem that doesn't exist. It might still be an idea to get rid of that problem in the first place, but I want to emphasize that it's not an actual problem in our code here. And since I recorded the course before the release of this null safety feature, throughout this course you'll have various situations where those null safety checks would complain about issues that aren't really issues and that won't lead to problems in the app. Here the problem it's complaining about is that question text. The question text I'm extracting here could theoretically be null because Dart doesn't understand our code here good enough to see that it actually can't ever be null, because the way we configure all those questions, every question text has a non-null string value. But Dart doesn't understand our code good enough to see that, and therefore this question mark here after object in this error message signals that Dart thinks that this could be an object value, so any kind of value, but it could also be null. And a null value would cause an error here, even though we as a developer of course know that in this case here, question text can't ever be null, because the way we set up our questions ensures that there is no question where the question text would hold a null value. But that's exactly the problem you can get with null safety. You get extra errors in cases where your code is absolutely fine. And that is why for this course I recommend that you turn off null safety, because I recorded the course before this feature was released, hence I didn't have those extra warnings, and hence there are code snippets that would cause these errors, even though the code I show you is absolutely fine. Alternatively, you can also try to improve the code to convince Dart that this won't ever be null by adding an exclamation mark after a statement where Dart thinks that it could be null. Then here the only remaining problem is that Dart sees that this is any object, so any value, not necessarily a string, and it's also not too happy about that, and therefore you can fix this issue as well by instead writing as string here, just as one line below that we're writing as list string. There we do that to convince Dart that this will be a list of strings. Now I'm doing this to convince Dart that this will be a string. And then I automatically, with that as string, tell Dart that it will always be a string, never null or anything like that. So with that, we then also fix this potential null issue in the same step, because I tell Dart that I as a developer know that this will never be null. So that's how we could fix this. But again, as mentioned before, my recommendation to follow along smoothly with exactly the same code you see in the videos is that you set your environment SDK version to greater or equal 2.11 instead of a higher value, because that will then disable these extra null safety checks. And the code you write is the same. The code works just fine. You just don't have these wrong error messages. Now, to conclude this lecture about null and null safety, I want to come back to the example from the beginning here in Dartpad. You might remember that here, if null safety was turned on, if I did set my string to null here, I got an error here. I got an error because now it is a string, and Dart infers that this variable should hold a string because we initialize it with a string, but I then set it to null. And null is not a string, it's a separate type, the type null. If we want to allow that we set this to null, so if we want to tell Dart that username is either a string or null, then we have to change the way we introduce this variable. Instead of writing it like this, we can write it like this with this question mark after the type name. With that, we're telling Dart that this should generally be a string, so we still wouldn't be allowed to store numbers or anything like that. But with the question mark, which is optional, we tell Dart that this might also hold a null value. So without the question mark, we still get the error we got before. With the question mark, we tell Dart, it's okay, this should be a string, but if it's null, that's also okay. So if you have null safety enabled, then you can use this question mark when introducing variables or function parameters or object properties to tell Dart that this variable, parameter, or property may have its main value type, but may also be null. And that's it for the null value and null safety at the moment. We will see null throughout the discourse in various examples. And as I mentioned, null safety is not covered in depth here because the course was recorded before that feature was released, but the code we write won't have any problems with null. So we also don't need it for this course.